Welcome everybody, welcome to this session about the deployment of the Workflow Manager engine for SharePoint 2013. My name is Paolo Pialorsi, and here you can find my email address as well as the URL of the website of my own company. Let me spend a few seconds about myself before focusing on the content of this session. I'm a consultant, a project manager and a trainer since 1996. I'm focused on Microsoft technologies, and in particular I'm focused on SharePoint since 2002, and I'm a Microsoft Certified Solution Master Charter SharePoint. In my life I wrote 10 books about XML, SOAP, .NET, Link and SharePoint, and in particular my latest book is the SharePoint 2013 Developer Reference published by Microsoft Press. Sometimes I'm a speaker at IT conferences, I speak at online events like this one and something like that. But now let's move to the real content of this session. We will see the architecture of the Workflow Manager and the Workflow Engine of SharePoint 2013 in order to understand the available topologies for deploying the Workflow Manager for SharePoint, and in order to achieve high availability for our server farms. We will see an interactive demo in which I will show you on a step-by-step basis how to deploy a Workflow Manager farm in a SharePoint 2013 farm. And then we will see very briefly some common issues and best practices for better results when you will need to deploy your own Workflow Services farms. From an architectural viewpoint, the biggest news we have in SharePoint 2013 is that now the Workflow Engine is an external component called Workflow Manager, which is based on a set of bits that you have to install manually aside from the SharePoint server farm. And from the SharePoint perspective, in the SharePoint side of the world, you will have a Workflow Services Manager engine, which will manage the deployment of workflow definitions, the instances of running workflows, and the messaging between the SharePoint 2013 farm and the Workflow Manager farm, which will run on a separate process, in an isolated process, and will communicate with the SharePoint 2013 using the Windows App Fabric Service Bus when the SharePoint 2013 farm has to notify some events to the Workflow Manager, and using the REST API when the Workflow Manager will have to call back the SharePoint environment. The security stuff is guaranteed by the OAuth protocol in the middle, in the communication between the Workflow Manager and the REST API published by SharePoint, and all the Workflow Manager engine will be available to SharePoint 2013 through a Workflow Client library, which will be used by a Workflow Service Application proxy that will be defined and configured on the SharePoint side of this architecture. Moreover, in case you want to support old style workflows based on the engine available in SharePoint 2010, you can still have, even in SharePoint 2013, an interop engine inside the Workflow Services Manager that will allow you to define and execute old style workflows. To design or create custom workflows, you can use the SharePoint Designer or the Visual Studio tool as you did in the past with SharePoint 2010. Of course, the new Workflow engine, which now leverages the Workflow 4.0 engine available in .NET Framework, will have a fresh new designer, either in SharePoint Designer or in Visual Studio. From a topology viewpoint, when you deploy a Workflow Manager farm, you should have one or more servers. We will talk about the suggested number of servers in a few minutes from now, but you should have one or more Workflow Manager servers within a workflow manager farm, and this farm will be available and accessible to the SharePoint server farm through a load balancer that will make transparent the number and the location of the single servers in the workflow manager farm. The same will happen when the workflow manager farm will have to communicate with the SharePoint farm, because also the workflow manager farm will communicate with SharePoint in case you have multiple servers in your SharePoint farm, moving through the load balancer that will publish all the front-end servers of your SharePoint farm through a unique address and through a unique endpoint. On the backend, the Workflow Manager farm will leverage a set of SQL Server databases that will store information about workflow definition, workflow instances, and so on. This is a common topology, and this is the one we will deploy in a few minutes from now. On the other side, you could also have the so-called Federated farm topology, which is a topology where you have a workflow manager cluster serving multiple SharePoint server farms. Pay attention that this scenario is really complex, and you should use it really carefully. It's not a common scenario. From an high availability viewpoint, because the workflow manager farm is based internally also on a service bus farm, and because Microsoft in the document linked on this slide states that the service bus for Windows Server only supports a farm with 1 or with 3 computers or servers, in order to achieve high availability, you should deploy the Workflow Manager engine and the service bus farm using 3 servers, because a deployment based on a single server should not be highly available, would not be highly available, because you would have only one server, and in case of failure of that server, your farm would be unavailable. On the other side, if you want to use more than one server, you have to use 3 servers, because of the architectural requirement of the service bus. So, an highly available Workflow Manager farm should be made of 3 servers with both the Workflow Manager and the Service Bus farms installed on top of them. And you should also publish your Workflow Manager servers through a network load balancer in order to have a unique URI to access the endpoint and to have access to the Workflow Manager farm. From an installation viewpoint, in order to install a highly available Workflow Manager farm, you should prepare 3 servers. You should install the Workflow Client 1.0 on all the SharePoint servers. You should install the Workflow Manager 1.0 on the Workflow servers. You should configure the Workflow farm on the first server, and you should join the just created Workflow farm with the other 2 servers. Then you should update the Service Bus engine using the cumulative update 1, and then after a reboot you should also update the Workflow Manager engine with the cumulative update 1 as well. After all these steps, you will be able to register in the SharePoint 2013 farm the Workflow farm, providing the load balanced URI that will be the endpoint to access the whole Workflow farm. So let me show you a demo about how to install on a step-by-step basis a real highly available Workflow Manager server farm. So imagine that you have a SharePoint 2013 server farm where you have a bunch of servers. For instance, you could have a couple of application servers as well as a couple of web front-end server in order to have high availability and load balancing. And moreover, you could have 3 workflow dedicated servers, because as you know, from a workflow manager viewpoint, from a service bus viewpoint, in order to have high availability for your workflow engine, you should have at least 3 nodes in a workflow manager cluster. So now we will install the workflow manager infrastructure on top of the SharePoint 2013 farm, as well as on the 3 workflow servers. First of all, we need to install the Workflow Manager client library on the 4 SharePoint servers, so SharePoint 2013 App 01 and 02, as well as Web Frontend 01 and 02. I'm already connected on this machine using remote desktop, and I will use the web platform installer to install the Workflow Manager client on these 4 machines. So let's start with the first one, which is the App 01 server. Here it is. And we can simply launch the web platform installer, which is available in a shared folder under the WPI launcher exe application. So this will be installed the platform installer 4.6, which is the last version we have right now. And let me look for Workflow Manager and Workflow Client. And here you can see I have the Workflow Client library. So I can simply add this one and install this one on this server, as well as on all the other servers in my SharePoint server farm. So let's accept the license, and why not use automatic update. And we are done. In a few seconds the Workflow client will be installed. We should do the same on all the SharePoint servers. So let's move to App Server 02 and do almost the same. SP 2013 DC1, go to Setups and launch the WPI launcher as well. Here it is. And in a few seconds we will be able to install the Workflow Client 1.0 on this machine as well. So Workflow Client, here it is, add and install. Again, accept, automatic update, and continue. And one more time, we are done. So imagine that we will do the same thing on the 2 web front-end servers. So now that we have installed the Workflow Manager client library on all the SharePoint servers in our SharePoint server farm, we can go forward and install the Workflow Manager as well as the Service Bus engine on the 3 Workflow Manager dedicated servers. So let's go to the first server, which is the WF1 server in my environment. And here I can simply launch the web platform installer. Here it is. And I can look for the Workflow Manager library. So I can search for it, Workflow Manager. This setup assumes that you are online, so in case you are not online, if you are not online with your servers, if your servers are not directly connected to internet, you can do a manual setup procedure. But in my case, my servers are all online because are all hosted on Windows Azure, which is by default connected to the internet network, so I can simply download and install all the tools and all the libraries online through the network. So let me choose to install the Workflow Manager 1.0, which will include some additional tools and files, because the Workflow Manager 1.0 has some requirements in order to properly run on a machine. Let me underline that here you can see as soon as I will look for the Workflow Manager keyword in the search engine, I will find multiple results. However, here I have to select the Workflow Manager 1.0 only, and even if there is a Workflow Manager 1.0 cumulative update 1, you shouldn't install this one, but you should first install the Workflow Manager 1.0, and only later, at later time, you will be able to update it with the cumulative update. So right now we will install the Workflow Manager 1.0. I have added it to the list of items to be installed, and I can simply click install. As you can see, the platform installer informs me that it will install a lot of many other tools, libraries and dependencies, and I can accept or not. Of course I need to accept in order to go forward, and I can click accept. In this case I will not choose to have automatic updates, because I would like to update the Workflow Manager as well as the service bus which is used by the Workflow Manager manually as soon as I will be able and ready to do that. So I will choose that the system will not update for me the environment, and I can click continue. So as you can see, there are 29 components that will be installed. It will take a little bit to install all of these components, and as soon as all these components will be installed, my Workflow 1 server will be ready to configure and to set up a new Workflow Manager farm. Then I will have to install the Workflow Manager on the two other servers, and I can do I can accomplish this task right now in parallel, while the web platform installer is downloading and installing the components on the Workflow 1 machine. So let me move to the other two machines and let me install the components on those machines as well. So let me go to run the web platform installer. Let me search the Workflow Manager engine. Workflow Manager, search for it. Again, I have to install the 1.0 version, the one from September of 2012. I can click on install. I can accept the license, and I can disable automatic updates. And one more time on the third server, so WF3. One more time, web platform installer. Search for Workflow Manager. Choose 1.0. Install. Accept the license without automatic updates and go on. As you can see, the Workflow Manager 1.0 setup has been completed, and now the web platform installer suggests you to run the configuration tool, the configuration wizard, to create your Workflow Manager farm or to join an already existing Workflow Manager farm. So we will move back to the Workflow Manager machine number 1, this one, and the setup is completed as well on this machine. So we can click on continue to start the configuration wizard, and here we can choose between the default and recommended settings for setting up a Workflow Manager farm, or we can use the configure Workflow Manager with custom settings in order to provide customized settings for the Workflow Manager farm. Of course, we can also use the option to join an already existing Workflow Manager farm, which will be the option we will choose in the second and third Workflow Manager machines. So, in our case, we will move to the Configure Workflow Manager with custom settings. But first of all, we will need to configure some environmental configuration settings. For instance, we will have to create an SSL certificate to secure the communication between the Workflow Manager farm and the SharePoint farm. We will also need to configure on each of the Workflow Manager servers a SQL Server alias targeting the real SQL Server engine we want to use, and we will define an alias in order to better manage the location of the SQL Server engine under the cover of our Workflow Manager and Service Bus environment. We will have also to create a user account in order to run both the Workflow Manager and the Service Bus services, and we'll have to provide all these settings and all this information to the Configure Workflow Manager with Custom Settings section of the configuration wizard. In order to create the SQL alias, we can simply use the SQL Configuration Manager tools, which can be used from the SQL Server Configuration Manager from the alias section of the SQL native client. Here you can see I have a SP 2013 SQL alias name, which maps to the SP 2013 SQL 1 physical server. We can achieve the same result also using a bunch of PowerShell scripting. Here you can see a simple script to register an alias. I can simply need to define the name of the real server as well as the alias name, and I can create a couple of registry keys in order to store the configuration of the alias in the Windows registry. So now I'm ready to configure my workflow farm. So I can simply click on the Configure Workflow Manager with Custom Settings, and I will have to provide the configuration information, so the name of the SQL Server instance, or the alias in my case, SP 2013 SQL. Let me test the connection, and it works. I have to provide the name of the database that will be created on the target SQL Server in order to store the configuration of my Workflow Manager as well as of the Service Bus engine. I can leave the default names, or I can provide custom names in case of need. Then I can provide some other configuration information about the user that will be used as the account for running the Workflow Manager services. In my scenario, I have created an SP workflow user in my domain, so I will use this one at sharepointcamp.com. Let me use the lowercase sharepointcamp.com. I can provide a password for that user, and this user will be the one that will be used to run the credentials, to run the instance of the Workflow Manager service, and it will be used also as the user account for running the Service Bus service. Then I have to make a choice about the SSL certificate. As I told you, we can use a real SSL certificate, for instance issued by a trusted certification authority. In my scenario, I have a domain trusted certification authority, which is trusted in my Active Directory domain. So I will not auto-generate a certificate, but I will select one from my personal certificate store. So I will have to browse and to choose this certificate, which will be the Workflow Manager certificate, which I have already created in my environment. I can do the same for all the other certificates that I will use in my environment. So the SSL certificate for the services, as well as the Workflow Manager outbound signing certificate and the encryption certificate. Then I can configure the ports on which my workflow manager will listen for client request, which can be the 2290 for the SSL secured communication on HTTPS, as well as an HTTP based port which by default will listen on 12291. I can enable and allow the workflow manager to talk over HTTP or not. It's my choice. I can make my choice on this topic, and then I have to provide the name of the Windows group that will be used as the group of workflow manager administrators. In my case, by default, you can see we have the built-in administrator of my local machine, but because I'm installing the workflow manager service in a farm with multiple servers in a shared Active Directory domain, I will provide a security group defined in my Active Directory. So in my case, I will use the group SharePoint camp sp workflow admins, which will be a group that I have already created in my Active Directory. Lastly, I can configure all the information about the service bus environment. So, just after checking the configuration parameters that I have provided, the Workflow Manager configuration wizard will ask me for all the information about the service bus configuration. It will take a while, a long while, and then we will have the opportunity to configure again the SQL Server instance name that will be used by the service bus, the name of the databases that will be used by the service bus, as well as the service account. As you can see, the SQL Server database instance is already provided. I can check it, but of course it worked in the previous test, so it will work right now as well. And then I can provide the name for the service bus management database and for the service bus gateway database. We will have also to configure the service bus message container database. It will take a while to check the connection against the SQL Server database. Okay, and it works. And then we can configure the service account that will be used by the service bus. We can provide an account different from the one we used for the workflow manager, but usually you should use and you can use the same account that you provided for the workflow manager. And again, you can select to use an auto-generated SSL certificate, or you can select the certificate that we used in the previous example. And in my case, I will use that one. So the Workflow Manager certificate to secure the communication of the service bus service. Then I will have to configure or to accept the default HTTPS and TCP ports used by the service bus service, and I will have to configure one more time the security group defining the user which will be the administrators of the service bus. And one more time I will use the SharePoint -camp sp workflow admins security group. And now I'm ready to configure my environment. So the configuration wizard will check again my configuration parameters provided about the service bus configuration, and as soon as the parameter will be checked, the configuration wizard will provision the workflow manager farm. It will take a few minutes to create the SQL Server database and to provision all the configuration stuff. And then we will be ready to join the same workflow manager and service bus farm with the other two servers, the workflow 2 and the workflow 3 machine. So it should be almost ready. It shouldn't take longer, as SharePoint states when executing its own tasks. But usually it takes a little bit longer than expected. Okay, as you can see, the configuration wizard prompts us with a summary of all the configuration steps that will be applied in order to provision our workflow manager farm. It's taking a little bit of time also to prepare the PowerShell script that will provision our workflow manager farm. And here you can see the result will be a PowerShell script that will be executed for us, and we can also copy and save for later use. And here you can see the summary, which provides us all the information, a recap of all the information we provided while configuring both the workflow manager and the service bus. And now we are ready to have a look at the PowerShell, or simply to execute the setup. We can get the PowerShell command, and here you have a simple text file, or you can run the configuration, and all this stuff will be provisioned, and all the services will be installed on the target workflow 1 server. So let's go back to the workflow 1 machine, and let's see if the setup is completing, the provisioning of the workflow manager farm is completing. Yes, it is completed. So here you can see all the task has been accomplished, and we can simply click on the close command button to close the configuration wizard. And now we are ready to join this server farm from the other workflow manager servers. We can click on the finish button, of course, and we can close the web platform installer. So let's go back to the virtual machine running the WF2 server, and click on the continue button in order to start the configuration wizard for this machine as well. Now we can choose the join an existing workflow manager farm option. We can provide the SQL Server alias, which will have to be configured on this machine as well. So you can use the PowerShell script that I've just shown you on the previous virtual machine, and which is available on a shared source in my server farm under the PS script folder. And here is the register SQL alias script. Okay, so we can select the PowerShell script and we can run it. Okay, so we can simply configure the SP2013 SQL alias for the SQL Server instance. We can test the connection, and it works. We can use the already available databases and check for the availability of all of these databases. We can provide the credential that will be used to join the workflow manager farm, and we have to provide the credentials for the SP workflow user we used. We can choose to publish this server using HTTP or HTTPS only. By default, the workflow manager service will be published using HTTPS only, so only in a secure way, and this is good. And then we have to configure also the service bus. We can use the same account that we use for the workflow manager also for the service bus. And again, the wizard will check the configuration settings we provided, will provide us with a recap of all the configuration settings we configured and we provided. We can one more time get the PowerShell script to provision the join of the workflow server in the workflow farm, and we can apply the configuration and make it ready, and we can really join this server to the workflow manager farm. It will take a few minutes. As you can see, this may take up to 10 minutes to complete, and usually it takes at least 3 or 4 minutes to complete. And we can do the same thing on the third server as soon as the second one will be ready. In order to check the availability of the workflow manager farm and of all the 3 servers inside the workflow manager farm, I can simply open up a web browser, let's say from a web front-end machine in my SharePoint server farm, and I can browse to the URL of the workflow manager cluster. In fact, I have defined in my DNS a static host name based on 3 different IP addresses using a round-robin load balancing technique, which is not that affordable, but for the sake of simplicity, I don't have a real load balancer in my virtualized environment. And here I can simply show you that WFM SharePoint-camp.com will represent the host name of the workflow manager farm. So I can go to my web browser, I can go to the security settings, and I can configure the URL we have just seen, https workflowmanager.sharepoint-camp.com as the URL of a local internet site, so that as soon as I will browse with my browser to https workflowmanager.sharepointcamp.com 12290, I will be able to see that here we have a workflow manager farm responding to my request, which is active and which will provide me information about its basic configuration. Now, in order to check the availability and the status of our workflow manager farm, we can also use a bunch of PowerShell scripting from one of the workflow manager servers, let's say WF1. We can start the PowerShell easy. We can import the workflow manager module, and we can call the get workflow farm cmdlet to check the status of the workflow farm, to check the workflow farm by itself. And here you can see we have the data source in the backend, the runners account, the admin group, as well as the hosts that made up the workflow farm. And we also have information about the certificate that is used by the workflow farm for the SSL, for the outbound, and for the encryption. So all the stuff we configured in the previous steps. We can also check the workflow farm status in order to see that all the servers in our farm are up and running, both with the backend and with the front-end services that are required by the workflow manager architecture and infrastructure. Now we should be ready to join our SharePoint 2013 server farm with the workflow manager farm. However, in order to do that, we need to update the Workflow Manager farm with the cumulative update 1.0 that has been released in March 2013 together with the public update of SharePoint 2013. So let's go to the web platform installer. Look for the service bus cumulative update as the first step to update the farm. And here you can see we have the service bus, which is already installed, but we also have the service bus cumulative update 1. We can add and install this package. This package will also have some dependencies. We can accept and install those dependencies. Sometimes during the installation of these dependencies the setup can fail, and you can simply reapply the setup, and usually it works after applying it a second time. So wait for a while. As soon as the setup of the cumulative update of the service bus will be applied, the machine will be restarted to apply the upgrade. Okay, as you can see, it failed, but it's not a real failure. You can simply apply it again. Service bus. Here it is. You can add it. You can install it again. You can accept. And as you can see, this time it is installing the service bus update and it is restarting the VM. We can do the same for each of our virtual machines in our environment. So let's call the web platform installer on the second and on the third server, doing almost the same as we did before. Okay, so back to the first one. We can run one more time the web platform installer, and this time we can install the Workflow Manager cumulative update 1. Here it is. Add it and install it. Accept the license terms. And your workflow server number 1 will be updated. We can do the same with the second and the third server. So and it's done. So all the 3 servers are updated. So let me restart the servers. Server number 3, server number 2, and server number 1. And as soon as the 3 web server, the 3 workflow servers will have been restarted, we will be able to check the health status of the workflow engine, and we'll be able to join or to connect the SharePoint 2013 farm with the Workflow Manager farm. Let me try to connect with the workflow server number 1. Okay, it's ready. Okay, let's connect with the server number 2. Just to check if it is ready. Yes, it is. Okay, and number 3. Okay. So we can go to the server number 1 and we can check the status of the workflow engine. You can start the PowerShell easy, and one more time you can import the workflow manager module, and you can check the workflow farm, which is still there, as well as the workflow farm status, which is okay, all the services are running. So now we are really ready to connect our SharePoint 2013 server farm with the Workflow Manager server farm. So you can go to the SharePoint 2013 server farm and you can register your Workflow Manager farm. You can connect the SharePoint server farm with the Workflow Manager farm. In order to do that, you can execute a bunch of PowerShell scripting. First of all, you will need to load the PowerShell extensions for SharePoint. Then you can register your Workflow Manager farm against a target SharePoint environment, providing the URL, the URI of the workflow host, which will be the one you have just checked in the web browser. However, you should be careful about the way you publish your application. For instance, in my scenario, I have my intranet SharePoint site, which is published over HTTP. Meanwhile, the Workflow Manager is published over HTTPS. In a real production environment, usually you should use HTTPS for the intranet as well, for security reasons. But in my environment, which is just a development environment, I can and I would like to use an HTTP published intranet. So in order to make possible to trust using OAuth, the Workflow Manager engine and the SharePoint site, we will need to do a little change in the configuration of our security token service. So we will need to retrieve a reference to the current SP security token service configuration, and we will need to change this property, allow metadata over HTTP, which by default is false. We can enable this feature and we can update the configuration of our security token service. In case we want also to consume an app published over HTTP and not over HTTPS, we can also configure the allow OAuth over HTTP property, which again by default is false. Now, with this change in our configuration, we can register the Workflow Manager engine targeting our intranet in the SharePointCamp.com domain. So let's press F8 to execute this line of code. And as soon as this cmdelete will be executed, we will have the Workflow Manager farm connected with the SharePoint farm. Okay, we are done. Now we can try to retrieve the list of service application proxy, and we will see that we will have a workflow service proxy with this unique ID, and we can add this service application proxy to the service application proxy group we are using in our environment. So for instance, in my intranet.sharepointcamp.com I have an intranet services proxy group, and I can add, using the unique ID of my Workflow Manager proxy, the Workflow Manager service proxy to the list of services available in my proxy group. Now I'm ready to browse to the SharePoint Central Administration. I can open the Application Management session. I can go to the Manage Service Application section, and I can check the health status of the Workflow Manager Service Application. Here you can see I have the Workflow Service Application proxy. I can click on it, and I can see that my workflow service status is connected. And from the application management viewpoint, under the Manage Web Application, in my Internet SharePoint camp, in the Service Connections, I have the Workflow Service Application proxy connected to my web application. So now I'm ready to go back to my local environment. I can start the SharePoint Designer tool in order to try to create a new workflow using SharePoint 2013 Workflow Manager engine. Let me open SharePoint Designer and let me connect to the target intranet site in the SharePoint.camp.com domain. Let me provide my SP admin credentials. Okay, and let me access the SharePoint 2013 intranet site. As soon as the site will be available in SharePoint Designer 2013, I will be able to create a new workflow definition targeting any target list or the whole site. And I will be able to choose a workflow of the new SharePoint 2013 engine. So here it is, the site in SharePoint Designer. Let me go to Workflows, and let me choose the ribbon to create a new list workflow targeting, for instance, the documents library. And here you can see I have the SharePoint 2010 as well as the SharePoint 2013 workflow engine. And what I can do is simply to create a Hello World workflow. I can click OK, and here I will be able to create my new workflow definition targeting the new SharePoint 2013 server farm with my free servers providing the Workflow Manager farm engine. So, for instance, I can simply write or log something to the history, something like here I am, and I can go to the end of my workflow. I can save. OK. And I can publish the just saved workflow targeting my new target document library. The publishing phase takes a little bit longer than the saving phase, because it will need to publish the workflow definition onto the target workflow manager farm as well. And as soon as the workflow will be published, we will be able to play with it and to run it against our document library. So let me access using, for instance, Internet Explorer. Let me browse to the Internet SharePoint camp website, and let's go to the documents and document library. There I can upload a document. Let's say this one. And as soon as the document will be uploaded, I will be able to go to the list of available workflows. And here you can see I have my Hello World workflow. I can start it, They can go back to the workflows page to check the status of the workflow, and the workflow is completed. If I go inside the workflow status page, I can see in the workflow history the comment "Here I am" written by the SP admin users who run the workflow instance against this document. So you are done. You completed all of your tasks. So, now that you have seen how to deploy a real Workflow Manager farm highly available, let's move to some common issues and best practices. First of all, you should remember that your workflow servers will need to be accessible by the SharePoint servers. So you will have to properly configure your DNS records. You will have to check network availability of the workflow servers from the SharePoint servers, as well as backward from the SharePoint servers to the workflow servers. And you will also have to check the loopback check issues which could happen in your environment. You should also create an SSL certificate to secure the communication between SharePoint and the Workflow Manager farm, and you should trust it on SharePoint, or you should issue the certificate using an Active Directory certification authority, which is by default trusted in the domain, in the Active Directory domain in which you will install the SharePoint and the Workflow Manager server farm. You should also create a dedicated user account in order to run the workflow and the service bus services. And you should keep in mind that you will have to configure properly the permissions of this service account, both against SharePoint and against the databases that will be used by the Workflow Manager. So, for instance, you will have to properly configure the role of this service user against the instance management database of Workflow Manager. Lastly, you should also carefully consider the choice about the protocol that you will use to publish the site on the SharePoint side, as well as the Workflow Manager engine. And in case you will use HTTP or HTTPS, you will have to keep in mind that you could have to change the out-of-the-box configuration of the SharePoint security engine. For further references about the topics we covered, I can suggest you to take a look at the following online available documents from Microsoft, as well as from some other colleagues on the network like Spencer Arbar or Steve Peshka, who published very interesting articles about the workflow engine and about the security engine of SharePoint related to trusting SharePoint farms and external farms like the Workflow Manager 1 or an Exchange server farm or something like that. So that's all for this session. Thank you very much for attending. Keep in mind this is my email address in case of need. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next time. Bye bye.